Before it became one of the most studied tornadoes in modern history, it appeared on radar as just one storm among many developing across the Great Plains. Yet within a few hours, that storm would leave behind damage so extreme that investigators would spend days examining the ruins, trying to determine where it belonged in the history of tornadoes. What they found in Greensburg, Kansas, would challenge assumptions, test a newly introduced rating system, and raise a question that lingered long after the debris was cleared. Just how powerful had this tornado been? As you move through this story, you will follow the storm from its earliest formation to the evidence it left behind, tracing how an ordinary spring evening became a defining moment in tornado history. Along the way, you will encounter a supercell that refused to die, a town that seemed to disappear overnight, and an investigation that ultimately transformed Greensburg into one of the most important tornado case studies ever recorded. An evening that felt like any other. In the fading light of an early May evening, Greensburg, Kansas, sat quietly on the open plains much as it had countless times before. The town was small, home to roughly 1,500 people, surrounded by farmland and wide horizons where weather was a familiar part of daily life. Storms were not unusual here. Spring often brought dark clouds, strong winds, and the possibility of severe weather. Yet there was something about the atmosphere on May 4, 2007, that caused people to pay closer attention than usual. Long before the night was over, residents would find themselves remembering ordinary moments from that evening with remarkable clarity, wondering how a day that appeared so routine had been moving towards something so extraordinary. Throughout western Kansas, weather forecasters were closely monitoring conditions as the afternoon progressed. The National Weather Service and the Storm Prediction Center had identified the potential for severe thunderstorms across parts of the Great Plains, prompting a tornado watch to be issued for portions of the region. For many residents of Greensburg, however, such alerts were hardly rare. Living in Tornado Alley meant becoming accustomed to forecasts that warned of dangerous weather that never fully materialized. Watches were often taken seriously, but they did not necessarily signal immediate danger. They were part of life on the plains, reminders to stay alert while continuing with normal routines. Warm temperatures lingered across the region through the afternoon, and the sky carried subtle signs that the atmosphere was becoming increasingly unsettled. Clouds gradually developed over distant stretches of the horizon, while winds shifted across the open countryside. Farmers, business owners, and families preparing for the weekend were aware that storms were possible, yet few had reason to believe that Greensburg would soon become the focus of national attention. At that stage, the threat remained broad and uncertain, spread across hundreds of miles of the central United States. As evening approached, thunderstorms began erupting farther south and west. Radar operators and meteorologists watched clusters of storms organize and strengthen as they moved across the high plains. Some communities experienced heavy rain, large hail, and strong winds. Reports from various locations suggested that the atmosphere was becoming increasingly favorable for severe weather. Even so, storms frequently formed across western Kansas during spring without producing catastrophic outcomes. Many residents had seen dramatic forecasts before and emerged the next day with little more than rain-soaked streets and stories about another close call. The first signs of rough weather eventually reached Greensburg as darkness began to settle over the town. Rain swept through the area, accompanied by gusty winds and bursts of hail. Lightning occasionally illuminated the landscape, briefly revealing low clouds moving overhead before darkness returned. Residents paid attention to weather reports, listened for updates, and kept an eye on the sky whenever conditions allowed. For a period, it appeared that the storm passing through town might represent the worst of the evening's weather. That impression was reinforced as the initial storm gradually moved away. The strongest winds diminished, the rain began easing, and no tornado had appeared. Across Greensburg, many people experienced a sense of relief. The tornado watch remained in effect, but the immediate threat seemed to have passed. Families resumed conversations interrupted by weather updates. Some prepared for bed while others continued following local broadcasts out of caution rather than concern. The atmosphere felt noticeably calmer than it had only an hour earlier. What few residents could see was the activity unfolding far beyond the limits of town. Meteorologists tracking storms across the region had begun focusing on a particularly dangerous thunderstorm moving through southwestern Kansas. Unlike ordinary thunderstorms that weakened after releasing their energy, This storm displayed signs of increasing organization. It was developing characteristics associated with the most powerful types of severe weather systems, drawing growing attention from forecasters who understood what such storms could become under the right conditions. As the evening progressed, weather information arriving from radar systems, trained spotters, and storm chasers painted an increasingly troubling picture. Tornado warnings were issued for areas beyond Greensburg as reports indicated that tornadoes had already begun forming beneath the storm. Some touched down briefly before lifting again. Others developed and dissipated within minutes. To people outside the meteorological community, these reports were simply one more example of severe weather somewhere else. To forecasters, they suggested that the storm was evolving in ways that demanded close attention. Hours after the first concerns about severe weather had emerged, Greensburg remained standing beneath a dark Kansas sky. The town had already endured one round of storms and appeared to have escaped serious damage. From the perspective of many residents, the danger seemed increasingly distant. The sounds of rain and hail had faded. The streets were still there. Homes remained intact. Life, at least on the surface, appeared ready to continue as normal once morning arrived. Far to the southwest, however, a storm was beginning to reveal capabilities that would soon challenge every assumption about what that night might bring. Before Greensburg could understand the danger moving toward it, the atmosphere across the Great Plains had to complete a chain of events that forecasters had been watching develop for hours, the ingredients for disaster. Before anyone in Greensburg could understand the danger moving toward them, the atmosphere had already begun arranging the conditions that would make it possible. The process had not started that evening, nor had it begun when tornado watches first appeared on weather maps. Long before residents looked toward darkening skies or listened for updates on local broadcasts, a series of changes had been developing across a vast portion of the United States. Most of those changes were invisible to the people living beneath them. Yet meteorologists studying weather observations throughout the day understood that the atmosphere was becoming increasingly favourable for severe storms, even if no one could yet determine exactly where the greatest danger would emerge. Hundreds of miles beyond the town's quiet streets, powerful processes were unfolding across the central United States, with little sign of the destruction they would eventually help produce. Weather systems rarely operate in isolation. What happens over one state can influence conditions hundreds of miles away, and the events of May 4, 2007 were tied to atmospheric features spanning much of the western half of the country. Across the Great Plains, forecasters were watching those features interact in ways that suggested the possibility of significant severe weather before the day was over. Moisture streaming northward from the Gulf of Mexico was steadily transforming the lower atmosphere over the plains. This warm, humid air provided the fuel thunderstorms require to grow and strengthen. During spring, the return of Gulf moisture is a common ingredient in severe weather outbreaks, but its presence alone does not guarantee dangerous storms. What made forecasters pay attention was the amount of moisture being transported northward and the extent to which it was spreading across the central plains. The atmosphere was becoming increasingly rich in the energy needed to support powerful thunderstorm development. Forecasters examining weather data throughout May 4th recognized that several important ingredients were beginning to align across the region. Forecast models, surface observations, upper air measurements, and satellite imagery all contributed pieces of a larger picture. No single data set revealed the entire story. Instead, meteorologists relied on the accumulation of evidence, comparing multiple observations to determine how the atmosphere might evolve during the coming hours. The process resembled assembling a puzzle whose final image was not yet clear, but whose pieces were beginning to fit together in concerning ways. High above the surface, a broad upper-level trough was pushing eastward from the Rocky Mountains and altering wind patterns across the western plains. These large-scale disturbances play a crucial role in severe weather events because they help generate lift within the atmosphere and strengthen winds at higher altitudes. To people on the ground, the movement of such features often goes completely unnoticed. Yet meteorologists understand that conditions many thousands of feet above the surface can significantly influence whether thunderstorms remain ordinary or evolve into something far more dangerous. Closer to the ground, a developing area of low pressure over southeastern Colorado was helping organize the environment below. Low-pressure systems act as focal points for atmospheric motion, encouraging air to converge and rise. As air rises, it cools and condenses, providing the foundation for cloud and thunderstorm development. The strengthening low-pressure system was also assisting in drawing warm, moisture-rich air farther northward into the plains, helping create a more unstable atmosphere across portions of Kansas and neighbouring states. Separating warm, humid air from much drier air to the west was a boundary that meteorologists know as a dry line. While cold fronts often receive more public attention, dry lines are among the most important severe weather features in the central United States. On one side lies moisture-rich air capable of fueling thunderstorms. On the other hand lies hot, dry air descending from higher elevations in the western states. Where these air masses meet, the atmosphere is often forced upward, creating an environment favourable for thunderstorm initiation. On May 4th, the dry line was positioned in a way that drew particular interest from forecasters monitoring the region. Taken individually, each of these atmospheric features was familiar to weather forecasters across Tornado Alley. Moisture transport, low-pressure systems, dry lines, and upper-level disturbances are recurring components of plains weather. Most days that contain one or even several of these ingredients do not produce historic tornadoes. What concerned meteorologists was not the presence of any single feature, but the way multiple favourable ingredients were appearing simultaneously. Experience had shown that when enough of these factors overlap, the atmosphere can become capable of supporting exceptionally intense storms. Meanwhile, unusually warm temperatures across western Kansas were adding even more energy to an already unstable environment. Under mostly clear skies during much of the day, solar heating allowed temperatures to climb into the mid-80s in some areas. Warm surface temperatures help create instability by increasing the contrast between air near the ground and cooler air higher in the atmosphere. The greater this contrast becomes, the more readily air can rise. Rising air is the engine that drives thunderstorms, and throughout May 4th, that engine was gradually being supplied with more fuel. Throughout the afternoon, updated observations continued to reinforce concerns that severe thunderstorms could become increasingly dangerous after sunset. Forecast discussions issued by meteorological agencies reflected a growing awareness that the environment was capable of supporting strong storms. Although uncertainty remained regarding the precise timing and location of development, the overall pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Conditions across portions of the plains appeared increasingly favourable for rotating thunderstorms, the type most closely associated with significant tornadoes. What made this situation particularly troubling was the growing overlap between instability, moisture, lift, and wind shear. Wind shear refers to changes in wind speed and direction with height, and it is one of the key ingredients required for supercell thunderstorms. When sufficient wind shear exists, thunderstorms can develop persistent rotating updrafts that allow them to sustain themselves for long periods of time. These rotating storms are responsible for many of the strongest tornadoes ever documented. Forecasters recognized that the atmosphere over western Kansas was becoming increasingly supportive of precisely that type of storm structure. By evening, the atmosphere over portions of Kansas had become capable of supporting the type of rotating storms most closely associated with violent tornadoes. Yet the outcome was still far from certain. Favorable conditions do not automatically guarantee catastrophe. Countless severe weather days produce storms that never reach their full potential. Some weaken unexpectedly. Others form in less favourable locations. At that stage, meteorologists knew the environment was dangerous, but they could not know which communities might eventually find themselves in the path of the strongest storms. Far to the southwest of Greensburg, towering thunderstorm clouds were beginning to rise into an environment that seemed ready to sustain them. As warm air surged upward through the unstable atmosphere, the first storms of the evening began taking shape across the southern plains. To most observers, they appeared no different from countless thunderstorms that had formed before them. Yet the atmosphere surrounding these developing storms contained a combination of ingredients that forecasters had been monitoring all day, and some of those storms were about to encounter conditions unusually favourable for continued growth and organisation. One of those storms was about to develop characteristics that would set it apart from every other thunderstorm on the plains that night. A supercell comes to life. As daylight faded across the southern plains, a developing thunderstorm began exhibiting traits that separated it from the countless other storms forming that evening. The atmosphere that had spent the day accumulating energy was finally beginning to release it, and across portions of the Texas Panhandle and western Oklahoma, towering clouds were rising rapidly into the upper atmosphere. Most thunderstorms that form on any given day live relatively short and unremarkable lives before weakening and collapsing. Yet meteorologists monitoring conditions on May 4, 2007 were beginning to notice signs that one particular storm was behaving differently. At first, those differences were subtle. Nothing about its appearance from a distance would have immediately suggested that it was destined to become one of the most studied storms of its kind. Fed by an atmosphere rich in moisture and instability, the growing storm quickly expanded both vertically and in strength. Warm air near the surface rose aggressively into cooler air above, producing powerful updrafts capable of sustaining extensive thunderstorm development. Throughout the afternoon and early evening, conditions across the region had become increasingly favourable for severe weather, and this storm was now taking advantage of those conditions. The energy that had accumulated over hours was being converted into motion, allowing the storm to grow taller, stronger, and more organised as it moved northeastward across the plains. Radar operators watching the storm's evolution soon detected evidence of persistent rotation within its core. Rotation is not uncommon within severe thunderstorms, but the degree to which it organises and strengthens often determines whether a storm becomes particularly dangerous. Weather radar provided forecasters with an increasingly detailed picture of what was occurring inside the storm, revealing that its internal structure was becoming more coherent rather than less. Instead of weakening as many storms do after reaching maturity, it appeared to be settling into an environment where continued growth remained possible. Unlike many neighbouring thunderstorms that struggled to maintain their structure, this storm continued organising itself with remarkable efficiency. Across the plains, numerous storms formed in response to the favourable environment, but not all of them evolved in the same way. Some weakened after brief periods of intensification. Others produced hail or heavy rain before gradually losing their organisation. This storm, however, displayed a capacity for persistence that increasingly attracted the attention of meteorologists. The atmospheric ingredients discussed earlier were not merely present, they were interacting in a way that allowed the storm to sustain itself over a prolonged period. Embedded within the storm was a rotating updraft known as a mesocyclone, one of the defining features of a supercell. Supercells represent a relatively small percentage of thunderstorms, yet they are responsible for many of the most significant tornadoes ever documented. Their rotating cores allow them to survive far longer than ordinary storms, often maintaining strength while continually reorganizing themselves. By the evening of May 4th, the storm moving across the southern plains had evolved into precisely this type of weather system. It had become a supercell, and that distinction would prove increasingly important as the night progressed. Shortly after moving into an increasingly favourable environment, the storm produced its first tornado. The tornado did not remain on the ground for an extended period, nor did it immediately signal the extraordinary events that would follow later in the evening. Instead, it served as evidence that the storm's rotating circulation was capable of extending downward toward the surface. Tornado production transformed the storm from a concerning weather system into an actively dangerous one, prompting meteorologists to monitor it even more closely as it continued moving northeastward. Rather than marking the end of the storm's development, that initial tornado signaled the beginning of a repeating cycle. Supercells often undergo a process known as cyclic behavior, during which one area of rotation weakens while another strengthens and takes its place. This allows the storm to continue producing tornadoes without losing its overall structure. On May 4th, the storm demonstrated exactly this tendency. As one tornado dissipated, the storm reorganized and prepared to generate another. What might have appeared to casual observers as separate events were, in reality, connected chapters in the life of a single storm. Successive periods of strengthening and reorganization allowed the storm to remain active while continuing to generate new circulations. Each cycle revealed a storm capable of maintaining itself within an unusually supportive environment. Forecasters observed that the storm was not merely surviving from one hour to the next, it was adapting, reorganizing, and continuing to find ways to sustain its intensity. The pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Every new cycle suggested that the storm possessed the potential to remain dangerous for a considerable period of time. Meteorologists following the storm on radar began recognizing a pattern that demanded closer attention. Severe thunderstorms capable of producing multiple tornadoes are rare enough to warrant concern on their own. A storm capable of repeatedly cycling while maintaining strong rotation represents an even more significant threat. Radar imagery provided a continuous stream of information about the storm's evolution, allowing forecasters to observe changes in its structure as they occurred. The evidence increasingly pointed toward a supercell capable of producing additional tornadoes as long as favourable conditions remained in place. Additional tornado reports arriving throughout the evening confirmed that the storm was maintaining a dangerous level of intensity. Several tornadoes formed during the storm's progression across the region, some remaining relatively brief while others persisted longer. Collectively, they demonstrated that the storm was repeatedly generating the conditions necessary for tornado genesis. The exact location of each tornado varied as the storm evolved, but the broader pattern remained consistent. This was no longer a thunderstorm occasionally producing rotation, it had become a tornado-producing machine. What distinguished this storm from many others was the consistency with which it regenerated and continued producing tornadoes. By this point in the evening, the storm had already demonstrated a capability that only a limited number of supercells ever achieve. It was able to cycle repeatedly while maintaining enough organization to continue generating new tornadoes. That ability would eventually lead to a remarkable statistic. By the time the storm's life cycle finally ended, it would have produced an extraordinary family of tornadoes across the plains. Yet during these earlier stages, forecasters could only observe the pattern emerging. They knew the storm was unusual, but they could not yet know the full extent of what lay ahead. Elsewhere across western Kansas, evening routines continued as most residents remained focused on local weather conditions rather than distant storms. The events unfolding farther south and west existed primarily on radar screens, weather maps, and communications between meteorologists, spotters, and emergency officials. For many communities, the storm was still little more than a distant weather concern. Its most dangerous characteristics had not yet drawn widespread public attention, and the areas eventually threatened by its path had little reason to suspect that they would soon become the focus of increasing concern. With every passing mile, the storm was becoming more organized, more efficient, and increasingly capable of producing significant tornadoes. The atmospheric conditions supporting it remained firmly in place, allowing the supercell to continue its northeastward journey without showing signs of rapid weakening. Meteorologists watched as it evolved through another cycle, recognizing that the storm remained far from finished. Somewhere ahead of it lay communities that had not yet entered its path, and the behavior of the storm suggested that its most consequential moments might still be approaching. Ahead of the storm's advancing path, subtle changes within its circulation were beginning to influence where the greatest danger would emerge. The tornado that changed direction. Subtle shifts occurring within the storm's rotating structure were beginning to influence its future path across western Kansas. For much of its life, the supercell had behaved like a remarkably efficient machine, producing tornadoes, reorganizing itself, and continuing forward through an environment that seemed almost perfectly designed to sustain it. Yet supercells are rarely static systems. They constantly evolve as new circulations form and old ones weaken. On the evening of May 4, 2007, those internal changes were becoming increasingly important, because they would ultimately affect where the storm's greatest threat would be concentrated. At the time, however, those changes were visible only to the people studying the storm most closely. New radar scans arriving at forecast offices revealed a circulation that was becoming increasingly pronounced with each update. Meteorologists at the National Weather Service in Dodge City monitored the storm continuously as it moved northeastward across western Kansas. Radar technology allowed them to peer inside the storm in ways that would have been impossible only decades earlier. Patterns within the data suggested strong rotation and an organized structure consistent with a dangerous supercell. Each new scan provided another piece of information, and collectively those pieces were painting a picture that was becoming more concerning as the evening progressed. Out on the plains, storm chasers followed the supercell through the darkness while relaying critical observations from the field. Unlike radar, which interprets precipitation and wind movement from a distance, storm chasers could provide direct visual confirmation of what was occurring beneath the storm. Their reports helped forecasters understand how conditions on the ground compared with what appeared on radar screens. During major severe weather events, these observations can become extremely valuable, particularly when storms are producing tornadoes after sunset. The information arriving from experienced observers was increasingly consistent with what meteorologists feared they were seeing. Intermittent flashes of lightning exposed brief outlines beneath the storm that were difficult to ignore. Darkness concealed much of the storm's structure, but occasional bursts of illumination revealed a large tornado beneath the rotating cloud base. These fleeting glimpses offered visual confirmation that the storm remained capable of producing significant tornadoes. The scenes were visible only for moments before darkness reclaimed the landscape, yet those moments were enough to communicate the seriousness of the situation. Storm chasers observing the tornado understood that they were witnessing a storm that had not only sustained itself for hours, but was continuing to demonstrate extraordinary strength. Confirmation from trained spotters added to growing evidence that a large and dangerous tornado was underway. Weather forecasting depends heavily on observations from multiple sources, and reports from individuals positioned near storms often help validate what radar operators are seeing remotely. As reports accumulated throughout the evening, confidence increased that a significant tornado was on the ground. The concern was no longer hypothetical. Meteorologists were now dealing with an active and verified threat moving across western Kansas under the cover of darkness. Faced with increasingly alarming information, meteorologists responded by strengthening their warnings to communities farther ahead of the storm. Tornado warnings had already been issued earlier in the evening as the storm demonstrated its ability to produce tornadoes, but warning language evolved as confidence in the threat increased. Forecast offices do not issue stronger warnings lightly. Such decisions reflect a combination of radar evidence, storm reports, and professional judgment. On May 4th, the information being received suggested that extraordinary caution was warranted. One particularly rare warning upgrade reflected just how seriously forecasters viewed the unfolding situation. During the evening, the National Weather Service issued a tornado emergency for areas threatened by the storm. Tornado emergencies are not separate warning products, but rather enhanced statements reserved for the most dangerous tornado situations, particularly when a large and destructive tornado threatens a populated area. The designation is used sparingly because of its significance. Its issuance communicated a level of concern that went beyond an ordinary tornado warning. Inside the storm, a new cycle of reorganization was quietly altering the relationship between the tornado and its parent circulation. Supercells often undergo a process known as occlusion, during which an existing circulation begins weakening while a new area of rotation develops nearby. This process can sometimes alter the path and behavior of a tornado. To someone observing from the ground, such changes might appear unpredictable. To meteorologists, however, they represented part of the complex life cycle of a mature supercell. On this evening, the storm's internal evolution would have consequences extending far beyond meteorological interest. Areas that had seemed safely removed from the storm's greatest danger were no longer appearing quite so secure. Earlier in the evening, the storm's movement and tornado track suggested one set of possibilities. As the supercell evolved, those possibilities began changing. Forecasting the exact path of a tornado remains one of the most difficult challenges in meteorology, particularly when dealing with cyclic supercells capable of producing multiple tornadoes. Small shifts in storm structure can produce significant differences in where the most dangerous conditions ultimately occur. For the residents of Greensburg, the threat was beginning to move from the background of weather reports toward the center of attention. The town was already familiar with severe weather. Earlier storms had passed through the area, and many residents had experienced the sense of relief that comes when a warning fails to materialize into disaster. Yet weather information arriving throughout the evening suggested that this storm deserved closer attention. The danger was no longer confined to distant locations appearing on radar maps. It was moving steadily closer to Greensburg. Successive updates from radar and field observers painted an increasingly troubling picture of the storm's evolution. The tornado remained large and dangerous, while the supercell continued displaying characteristics associated with some of the strongest thunderstorms in nature. Every new report reduced uncertainty about the severity of the threat. The question facing forecasters was no longer whether the storm was capable of producing a destructive tornado. The evidence had already answered that. The growing concern centered on where that destructive potential would be realized. Throughout the town, warning sirens echoed across streets where many people had already begun believing the worst weather might pass elsewhere. Sirens serve a simple purpose. They communicate urgency when time is limited. As they sounded across Greensburg, residents responded in different ways. Some sought additional information from television or radio broadcasts. Others moved toward basements and shelters. Many had experienced tornado warnings before, yet the warnings issued that evening carried an unusual level of seriousness. Beyond the town limits, meteorologists, emergency officials, storm chasers and spotters were all observing the same storm and reaching increasingly similar conclusions about the danger it posed. Only a narrowing stretch of prairie remained between Greensburg and the most dangerous part of the storm. The supercell had spent hours demonstrating its strength through repeated tornado production, sustained rotation, and remarkable longevity. Now the focus was shifting toward a specific community lying ahead of its path. The atmosphere that had quietly assembled its ingredients throughout the day had produced a storm unlike most others. That storm had matured into a powerful supercell. The supercell had generated a succession of tornadoes, and as darkness settled over western Kansas, those developments were converging toward a moment that many residents could not yet fully imagine. The final decisions were being made as a dark and rapidly changing silhouette advanced toward the edge of town. The night Greensburg disappeared. Beneath homes, businesses, and public buildings across Greensburg, people gathered in shelters as the approaching storm drew closer. The warnings that had been issued throughout the evening were no longer distant notifications appearing on television screens or weather radios. By this stage, they had become immediate instructions. Families descended into basements. Business owners moved underground or sought stronger shelter. Conversations grew shorter as attention shifted toward the sounds coming from outside. For many residents, severe weather was a familiar part of life in Kansas, yet there was little way to know whether this approaching storm would become another close call or something far more significant. Above them, darkness concealed much of what was approaching. Moments later, the tornado entered the southern edge of town and began crossing directly through the community. The tornado that reached Greensburg shortly before 10 o'clock on the night of May 4th, 2007, was already large and violent. It had spent hours evolving within a powerful supercell that had repeatedly demonstrated its ability to generate tornadoes. Now, after crossing open stretches of western Kansas, it encountered a town of roughly 1,500 people. The distinction between countryside and community disappeared as the circulation moved forward. What had been a threat tracked on radar and reported by storm chasers became a direct encounter between one of nature's most powerful phenomena and an entire town. Inside basements throughout Greensburg, residents could only interpret the storm through sounds, movement, and instinct. Most could see nothing of the tornado itself. Instead, they experienced it indirectly through the violent shaking of buildings, the roar of wind, and the sensation that the world above them was being transformed by forces they could neither observe nor control. Survivors later described sounds unlike anything they had previously encountered. Some compared the noise to freight trains. Others struggled to find comparisons at all. The experience varied from shelter to shelter, yet the uncertainty remained constant. People could hear what was happening. They simply could not know what remained standing above them. Overhead, structures that had stood for decades were being exposed to extraordinary forces. Houses, businesses, schools, churches, and public buildings found themselves directly in the path of a tornado that would later receive the highest rating on the enhanced Fujita scale. Wind speeds associated with EF5 tornadoes are capable of producing catastrophic damage, and Greensburg would provide extensive evidence of that destructive potential. Buildings constructed over generations were suddenly confronting forces far beyond what they had been designed to withstand. Roofs failed, walls collapsed, entire structures were torn apart as the tornado continued advancing through the town. Stretching to roughly 1.3 miles in width, the tornado occupied an area larger than much of the town itself. This immense size helps explain why the damage became so widespread. Unlike smaller tornadoes that carve relatively narrow paths through communities, the Greensburg tornado engulfed a substantial portion of the town at once. Entire neighborhoods found themselves within the circulation simultaneously. There was little opportunity for damage to remain isolated to a single section of town. The tornado's scale meant that large portions of Greensburg were subjected to the storm's most destructive winds during the same period. Caught within the circulation were pieces of homes, vehicles, trees, utility poles, and countless other objects lifted into the air. Tornadoes are destructive not only because of their winds, but also because they transform ordinary objects into dangerous debris. As structures failed, fragments became part of the storm itself. The tornado carried materials across neighborhoods and beyond town limits, adding complexity to the destruction unfolding below. Throughout Greensburg, the distinction between individual buildings gradually disappeared as debris from numerous locations became mixed within the circulation. Minutes passed without any reliable way for those underground to know whether the buildings above them still existed. Time often behaves strangely during disasters. Brief moments can feel far longer when uncertainty dominates every second. For residents sheltering beneath the surface, the duration of the tornado's passage seemed disconnected from ordinary measures of time. The roar continued. Vibrations persisted. The darkness remained. Some people focused on weather radios. Others listened for changes in sound that might indicate the tornado was moving away. Yet while the storm remained overhead, certainty was impossible. Eventually, the storm's most intense winds began shifting beyond the northern portions of Greensburg. The tornado's life cycle was continuing, even as it left the town behind. Like many violent tornadoes produced by cyclic supercells, it evolved through processes occurring within the larger storm. The circulation that had inflicted catastrophic damage on Greensburg did not remain fixed indefinitely. Gradually, the centre of the storm's most destructive forces moved beyond the community. For those underground, however, this change was not immediately obvious. The difference between a tornado directly overhead and one moving away could be difficult to recognise amid the lingering noise and confusion. In the wake of the tornado's passage, an unfamiliar quiet gradually settled over the community. The contrast was striking. Moments earlier, the town had been engulfed by one of the most violent weather events in modern American history. Now, many residents found themselves listening to a silence that felt equally unsettling. The absence of sound did not provide reassurance. Instead, it created new questions. What remained above ground? Which buildings had survived? Which had not? Who else had made it through the storm? The silence offered no answers. Damage documented afterward would reveal why the storm became one of the most significant tornado events ever recorded. Survey teams would eventually determine that approximately 95% of Greensburg sustained damage or destruction. More than 900 structures were affected. Entire sections of town experienced devastation on a scale rarely encountered in modern American tornado disasters. Yet none of those statistics were known during the immediate aftermath. At that moment, residents understood only fragments of what had happened. The full picture would emerge later through surveys, investigations, and countless individual accounts. Entire blocks had been subjected to a level of destruction rarely observed in modern American disasters. Buildings that had served the community for generations suffered catastrophic damage or disappeared altogether. Trees were stripped and damaged. Infrastructure failed. Familiar features that residents relied upon for navigation and orientation were removed from the landscape. The tornado's path through Greensburg left behind evidence not only of extreme wind speeds, but also of the immense vulnerability that exists when a violent tornado intersects directly with a populated area. Long after the roar diminished, uncertainty remained inside shelters scattered throughout the town. Surviving the tornado itself did not immediately end the crisis. Families remained separated by collapsed structures and debris. Communication was limited. Darkness concealed much of the surrounding damage. People listened carefully for voices, movement, or any indication of conditions outside. The instinct to emerge and inspect the damage competed with the recognition that hazards might still exist above ground. In many locations, residents waited cautiously before venturing out. One by one, survivors began pushing open doors that had protected them only minutes earlier. Basements and storm shelters had served their purpose, preserving lives during the tornado's passage. Yet opening those doors required confronting whatever remained outside. For many residents, the transition from shelter to open air marked the beginning of a new and equally disorienting experience. The danger posed by the tornado itself had passed, but understanding its consequences was only beginning. Where familiar streets, landmarks, and buildings had once provided direction, darkness now concealed a profoundly altered landscape. Residents emerging from shelters found themselves in an environment that no longer resembled the town they had entered only a short time earlier. Without daylight, the extent of the destruction remained difficult to comprehend, but enough was visible to suggest that something extraordinary had occurred. Shapes that should have been houses were missing. Reference points that normally guided movement through town had vanished. In many locations, people struggled to determine exactly where they were standing. The first cautious steps into that darkness would reveal a town that few of its residents could immediately recognize. Walking into the darkness, stepping beyond the protection of basements and storm shelters, survivors encountered a landscape that seemed strangely unfamiliar. Only minutes earlier, many had been focused entirely on enduring the tornado itself, listening to the roar overhead and hoping the structures above them would remain intact. Now they were confronted with a different challenge. The danger posed by the storm had largely passed, but understanding what remained was far more difficult than many expected. Darkness covered much of Greensburg, concealing details while revealing just enough to suggest that something extraordinary had happened. The town people thought they knew appeared altered in ways that were difficult to immediately comprehend. Under a sky still dominated by darkness, it was difficult to determine where the town ended and the debris began. Electrical service had been disrupted across much of the community, eliminating many of the familiar points of light that normally define the nighttime landscape. Streetlights were absent. Buildings that once reflected light from windows and signs no longer served that purpose. In many places, survivors found themselves relying on moonlight, flashlights, and vehicle headlights to navigate. Even those who had lived in Greensburg for years sometimes struggled to recognize their immediate surroundings. Across the ruined community, voices soon carried farther than any remaining streetlights. In the absence of normal sounds, individual voices became surprisingly distinct. People called out names of family members, neighbors, and friends. Some shouted from debris-covered lots where homes had stood only minutes before. Others responded from nearby shelters or damaged buildings. These exchanges helped survivors begin establishing who was safe and who remained unaccounted for. During the first moments after the tornado, information was often limited to whatever could be communicated by voice through the darkness. Instinctively, many residents began looking for the people they had last seen before taking shelter. The search often started with immediate family members, but concern quickly expanded to include neighbors and friends. Greensburg was a small community where many residents knew one another personally. That familiarity shaped the early response. People emerging from shelters did not focus solely on their own property. Their attention often turned toward nearby homes and the people who might have been inside them when the tornado struck. Questions emerged almost immediately. Who had survived? Who still needed help? Who had managed to reach shelter in time? Brief beams from flashlights, vehicle headlights, and emergency lighting revealed only fragments of what surrounded them. A single light might illuminate a damaged wall, a section of roof, or a pile of scattered belongings before disappearing back into darkness. The limited visibility made it difficult to understand the scale of the destruction. Survivors were often able to see only a short distance in any direction. As a result, many initially perceived the damage as localized, assuming that perhaps their immediate neighborhood had suffered particularly severe impacts. The broader reality would take longer to emerge. Among the earlier searches undertaken that night was one involving a neighbor known to be inside a heavily damaged home. One of the most documented stories from the aftermath involved Dennis McKinney and his concern for neighbor Kelsey Schroth and her infant son. Schroth had been home when the tornado struck, and her house lacked a basement. After surviving the tornado himself, McKinney focused attention not on his own losses but on locating his neighbor. The search led him toward what remained of Schroth's home, which had been almost destroyed by the tornado. Throughout Greensburg, similar scenes unfolded as residents moved cautiously through piles of debris and collapsed structures. People navigated around damaged vehicles, broken utility lines, and scattered building materials while attempting to locate others. Every search involved uncertainty because the tornado had altered the environment so dramatically. Familiar routes were blocked, landmarks had disappeared, objects that normally belonged inside homes were scattered across yards and streets. Movement through town required caution because hazards existed in nearly every direction. Night concealed the full dimensions of the disaster, but it could not completely hide its severity. Even under limited visibility, certain facts became impossible to ignore. Buildings that should have been standing were gone. Entire sections of neighborhoods appeared flattened. In places where homes once lined streets, survivors found little more than foundations and debris. The darkness obscured the exact extent of the destruction, yet it could not disguise the fact that Greensburg had experienced a catastrophe far beyond an ordinary severe weather event. Gone were many of the visual reference points that people relied upon to orient themselves around town. Trees that had marked property boundaries were damaged or missing. Buildings that served as landmarks had vanished. Familiar intersections looked different because surrounding structures were no longer present. For some residents, the experience resembled entering an unfamiliar town, despite standing in the place where they had lived for years. The tornado had removed so many recognizable features that normal navigation became unexpectedly difficult. Gradually, separate observations from different parts of Greensburg began forming a more complete understanding of what had occurred. As survivors communicated with one another, isolated impressions merged into a larger picture. Someone emerging from one neighborhood reported severe destruction. Another described similar conditions elsewhere. Information spread through conversations, shouted exchanges, and brief encounters in the darkness. While nobody yet possessed a complete overview, the evidence increasingly suggested that the damage extended far beyond any single block or district. Far beyond isolated property damage, the destruction appeared to extend across much of the community. The realization emerged slowly because darkness limited visibility, but it became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Survivors began recognizing that numerous neighborhoods had been affected simultaneously. This was not a tornado that had clipped one edge of town or damaged a handful of structures. It had crossed directly through Greensburg, leaving destruction behind across a substantial portion of the community. The scale of the disaster was becoming clearer with each passing minute. Realization eventually gave way to urgency as concerns turned toward those who had not yet been located. Understanding the extent of the damage naturally led to another question. How many people might still be trapped beneath debris or unable to call for help? Survivors who had initially focused on understanding their surroundings increasingly directed their attention toward locating others. The atmosphere shifted from shock toward action. People continued searching for loved ones, checking damaged homes, and listening carefully for voices emerging from the darkness. The search for Kelsey Schroth eventually produced one of the night's most remarkable survival stories. After locating what remained of her home, rescuers heard a voice coming from debris near the site. Schroth and her infant son had survived inside a walk-in closet, despite the destruction around them. Both were found alive with relatively minor injuries. Their rescue offered a rare moment of relief amid overwhelming uncertainty, and reinforced the importance of continuing to search for others throughout the community. As more residents gathered information and moved through the damaged town, the sense of isolation that often follows disaster began giving way to collective effort. People who had spent the previous hour focused entirely on their own survival now found themselves becoming part of something larger. The need to understand the disaster was being replaced by the need to respond to it. Across Greensburg, survivors were no longer simply witnesses to what had happened. They were becoming the first people involved in confronting its consequences. What began as scattered calls into the darkness was about to become a coordinated effort to find anyone still trapped within the wreckage. The search for the living, echoes of voices moving through the darkness became some of the earliest signs that survivors were beginning to find one another. In the immediate aftermath of the tornado, organized rescue operations did not appear instantly. The first efforts came from the people who had just endured the storm themselves. Residents emerging from shelters called out to family members, neighbors, and anyone who might be nearby. Voices answered from damaged homes, from piles of debris, and from locations that were difficult to identify in the darkness. Each response provided reassurance that someone else had survived, but it also revealed how little anyone understood about the overall situation. The town was still trying to determine who was safe and who remained missing. Little reliable information existed during those first hours, leaving many families uncertain about the fate of loved ones. Communication systems had been disrupted, and normal methods of contacting relatives were often unavailable. The tornado had struck at night, further complicating efforts to gather information. People relied heavily on direct observation and word of mouth. A single report that someone had been seen emerging from a shelter could bring relief to worried relatives, while the absence of information often led to further concern. Across Greensburg, uncertainty remained one of the most difficult challenges during the hours following the disaster. Ordinary residents often carried out the initial searches long before larger rescue resources could fully mobilize. The people moving through the debris field were not necessarily trained responders. Many were homeowners, business owners, friends and neighbors attempting to help those around them. Despite dealing with damage to their own property and uncertainty about their own circumstances, they began checking nearby structures and calling out for anyone who might still need assistance. The response reflected the reality of small communities, where neighbours often know one another well, and where helping others becomes an immediate instinct during emergencies. Soon afterward, firefighters, law enforcement officers, emergency medical personnel and volunteers joined the growing effort. Local responders had experienced the same disaster as everyone else, yet they immediately faced the responsibility of helping the community recover from it. Assistance also began arriving from surrounding areas as news of the destruction spread. Emergency personnel entered an environment unlike a typical disaster scene. Streets were blocked by debris. Familiar landmarks were gone. Navigating through town required careful attention because the landscape itself had been fundamentally altered by the tornado. Navigating the debris field required rescuers to move carefully through conditions that remained hazardous well after the tornado had passed. Collapsed structures, broken utility lines, damaged vehicles, and scattered building materials created obstacles throughout Greensburg. Search efforts could not simply proceed at full speed. Responders needed to ensure that unstable debris did not cause additional injuries while they worked. In many locations, searches involved listening carefully for voices or other signs of life before moving material. The process demanded patience because rushing through dangerous conditions could easily create new emergencies. Additional discoveries throughout the night brought moments of relief amid the uncertainty surrounding the community. Survivors continued to emerge from damaged homes, basements, and shelters. Each successful discovery provided evidence that protective actions taken before the tornado had made a difference. Many residents had received sufficient warning to seek shelter, and those decisions were now saving lives. While the destruction visible across Greensburg suggested catastrophic loss, the growing number of survivors being located offered a different perspective. The damage was extraordinary, but so too were many of the survival stories. Faint indications of approaching daylight appeared while search efforts continued across the damaged town. Hours had passed since the tornado struck, yet many responders and residents remained focused on locating survivors. The transition from night to morning gradually improved visibility, allowing search teams to move more efficiently. What had previously been hidden by darkness slowly became visible, yet the arrival of daylight also carried a sense of apprehension. Better visibility would help rescuers, but it would also reveal more clearly what the tornado had done to Greensburg. Morning light exposed scenes that many rescuers had previously encountered only through flashlights and scattered vehicle headlights. Entire sections of town appeared transformed. Areas that had seemed damaged in the darkness now revealed destruction extending much farther than many had initially realized. Buildings that survivors assumed might still be standing were gone. Streets that had been difficult to navigate at night became easier to follow, but the daylight also highlighted the scale of the debris field. For some residents, this was the first opportunity to fully appreciate the extent of what had happened. Evidence of survival could often be found only a short distance from evidence of extraordinary destruction. One of the striking aspects of the Greensburg tornado was the contrast between the severity of the damage and the number of people who survived. Entire structures had been destroyed, yet many residents sheltered in basements or other protected locations managed to live through the storm. Throughout the community, examples of successful sheltering could be found, alongside scenes of devastating structural failure. These contrasts would later become important when experts examined why the death toll was lower than might have been expected given the magnitude of the destruction. Patterns gradually emerged as responders gathered information from different neighbourhoods and search teams. During the first hours after any major disaster, information often arrives in fragments. One team reports survivors in a particular area, another reports severe damage elsewhere. Over time, those fragments begin forming a clearer picture. In Greensburg, responders gradually developed a better understanding of where the greatest destruction had occurred and where assistance remained most urgently needed. This process helped direct resources more effectively as rescue operations continued. Remarkably, the number of survivors exceeded what many might have expected given the severity of the damage. Greensburg ultimately suffered 11 fatalities and dozens of serious injuries, a tragic toll for a town of its size. Yet considering that approximately 95% of the community sustained damage, and that more than 900 structures were affected, the number of survivors was striking. Numerous factors contributed to this outcome, including warning lead times, effective communication of the threat, and the widespread use of basements and shelters. Those factors would later receive considerable attention from meteorologists and emergency management professionals seeking to understand why so many lives had been saved. Beyond the immediate rescue effort, attention increasingly turned toward understanding the broader circumstances surrounding the disaster. As more survivors were located and the initial urgency began stabilizing, questions naturally expanded beyond individual rescues. People wanted to know how such destruction had occurred, how extensive the damage truly was, and what would happen next. Yet another realization was also emerging. The tornado that devastated Greensburg was not an isolated event disconnected from everything around it. It had been part of a much larger and highly unusual storm system whose story continued well beyond the town's limits. Far beyond the ruined streets of Greensburg, the same supercell was continuing to write new chapters in its extraordinary history, a storm that refused to end. Far from the damaged neighborhoods where survivors and rescuers searched through debris, the parent storm was still moving across Kansas. For the people in Greensburg, the disaster understandably felt complete. Their attention was fixed on missing neighbors, damaged homes, and the uncertain hours that followed the tornado's passage. Yet the weather system responsible for the destruction had not disappeared with the tornado that crossed the town. High above the plains, the supercell remained active, continuing a journey that had already lasted for hours. While one community struggled to understand what had happened, the storm itself was still evolving. Although the tornado that struck Greensburg eventually came to an end, the supercell that produced it showed little interest in ending its journey. This distinction is important because tornadoes, and the storms that generate them, are not always bound to the same lifespan. Individual tornadoes may form, strengthen, weaken, and dissipate while the parent supercell continues forward. That was precisely what occurred on the night of May 4th. The tornado that devastated Greensburg eventually occluded and dissipated north of town, but the rotating thunderstorm that had sustained it remained remarkably organized. Instead of weakening dramatically after producing a violent tornado, the storm continued moving northeastward. Within the larger storm, atmospheric processes were already generating the next cycle of development. Cyclic supercells are among the most fascinating and dangerous weather systems on Earth, because they possess the ability to repeatedly renew themselves. As one circulation weakens, another can develop nearby, allowing the storm to continue producing tornadoes over extended periods. Meteorologists had already witnessed this behavior earlier in the evening, but the storm's persistence after Greensburg reinforced how unusual it had become. The same environmental ingredients that helped create the tornado remained available, and the supercell continued taking advantage of them. New circulations emerged as the supercell continued drawing strength from an environment that remained highly supportive of severe weather. Warm, moist air persisted near the surface, while favourable wind patterns remained established throughout the atmosphere. Conditions that might have weakened many storms were largely absent. Instead, the supercell encountered an environment capable of sustaining organised rotation long after sunset. Darkness often coincides with a reduction in severe weather activity, yet this storm demonstrated little sign of following ordinary expectations. Its structure remained coherent, and its ability to generate tornadoes persisted. Communities farther along the storm's path soon found themselves receiving the same warnings that had reached Greensburg earlier in the evening. Weather offices continued issuing updates as the supercell moved across western Kansas. Forecasters remained focused on the storm because its behavior repeatedly justified concern. Radar continued detecting strong rotation, and reports from observers confirmed that the threat remained active. For communities located ahead of the storm, the experience carried an unsettling familiarity. The warnings arriving during the late evening hours were being issued because a storm that had already produced a violent tornado was still capable of producing more. Near Trousdale, another significant tornado developed beneath the persistent rotating storm. While the Greensburg tornado would eventually become the most widely remembered event associated with the supercell, it was not the final major tornado produced by the storm. The tornado near Trousdale provided further evidence that the supercell remained extraordinarily productive. By this stage, the storm had already spent hours demonstrating an ability to cycle repeatedly while maintaining its overall strength. The emergence of another significant tornado reinforced the growing realization that meteorologists were observing something uncommon. Expanding to an extraordinary width, This later tornado demonstrated that the supercell remained capable of producing extreme events. The Trousdale tornado eventually reached an estimated width of approximately 2.2 miles, making it even wider than the tornado that struck Greensburg. Such dimensions are difficult to visualize. A tornado of that size occupies an enormous portion of the landscape, capable of affecting vast areas simultaneously. The fact that the supercell could produce another tornado of such scale after already generating the Greensburg tornado highlighted its remarkable endurance. The storm seemed capable of repeatedly resetting itself and producing new episodes of severe weather. Researchers studying the outbreak would later point to the storm's endurance as one of its most remarkable characteristics. Many tornado-producing storms exist for only a fraction of the time achieved by this supercell. Severe thunderstorms frequently weaken as environmental conditions change or as internal processes disrupt their organization. This storm repeatedly avoided those outcomes. Instead, it maintained a structure capable of supporting long-term rotation and tornado production. Its longevity transformed it from a significant storm into a meteorological case study. Long after many thunderstorms would have weakened or dissipated, the supercell continued reorganizing and producing tornadoes. The storm's life cycle stretched well beyond what casual observers might expect from a single thunderstorm. Throughout the night, it repeatedly generated new circulations and additional tornadoes. This pattern illustrates why meteorologists often emphasize the importance of viewing supercells as evolving systems rather than isolated events. The Greensburg tornado was one chapter in the storm's history, not the entirety of it. The supercell's ability to sustain itself made it one of the most prolific tornado-producing storms of the outbreak. By midnight, the storm had already compiled a record that distinguished it from most tornado-producing systems. Hours had passed since the earliest stages of its development, yet it remained capable of producing severe weather. Its continued activity challenged assumptions about how long a single storm could remain organized and dangerous. Every additional tornado added to a growing record of persistence. For meteorologists tracking the storm, the cumulative picture was becoming increasingly impressive. They were observing a supercell that repeatedly demonstrated the ability to survive, reorganize, and continue generating tornadoes. Across its lifespan, the supercell generated a succession of tornadoes that reflected an unusually efficient cycling process. By the time the storm finally weakened, it had produced an astonishing family of tornadoes. Accounts of the outbreak commonly note that the supercell generated approximately 22 tornadoes during its existence. That figure alone communicates the storm's extraordinary productivity. More importantly, it illustrates the consistency with which the storm was able to regenerate favorable conditions for tornado formation. Each new tornado represented another successful cycle within a storm that seemed unwilling to end. Eventually, the moving storm began giving way to another phase of the story unfolding back in Greensburg. Meteorologists continued analyzing the storm's remarkable behavior, but attention increasingly shifted toward understanding the damage left behind. The tornado that struck Greensburg had already become one of the most significant events of the outbreak, and the destruction visible across the town demanded careful examination. Questions emerged regarding wind speeds, structural failures, and the true intensity of the tornado. The answers would require detailed investigation by engineers, meteorologists, and survey teams. Answering the questions left behind by the tornado would require investigators to examine damage unlike anything the new rating system had yet encountered. Measuring the destruction. Arriving after the immediate crisis had passed, damage surveyors entered Greensburg with the task of answering questions that the tornado itself could not. Rescue operations, emergency response efforts, and the search for survivors had dominated the first hours after the disaster. Now another phase was beginning. Meteorologists, engineers, and damage assessment teams arrived not to save lives, but to understand what had happened. The tornado had vanished into history the moment it dissipated, leaving behind only the evidence scattered across Greensburg. That evidence would become the foundation of an investigation aimed at reconstructing the strength of a force that no instrument had directly measured. Among the scattered debris and empty foundations, investigators searched for evidence capable of revealing the storm's true intensity. Tornadoes are often evaluated after they occur because direct measurements of wind speed within the most violent portions of a tornado remain rare. Instead, surveyors examine what the tornado left behind. The process requires patience and attention to detail. Every damaged structure, uprooted tree, and displaced object can contribute information about the winds responsible for the destruction. In Greensburg, there was no shortage of evidence to examine. Nearly every part of town offered clues. Unlike eyewitness accounts, physical damage provided a record that could be examined, compared, and measured. Human observations remain valuable, particularly when documenting the behavior of a tornado, but estimating tornado intensity depends heavily on damage assessment. Memories can be incomplete or influenced by the chaos of a disaster. Debris fields and structural failures, by contrast, remain visible long after the event itself. Investigators, therefore, approach Greensburg much like detectives approaching a complex scene, looking for patterns capable of revealing what had occurred during the minutes when the tornado crossed the town. Recently adopted by the meteorological community, the enhanced Fujita scale offered a new framework for interpreting tornado damage. The enhanced Fujita scale, commonly known as the EF scale, had been implemented in the United States in early 2007, only months before the Greensburg tornado. It replaced the original Fujita scale and was designed to provide more accurate estimates of tornado intensity by incorporating detailed engineering knowledge. Rather than relying solely on broad descriptions of damage, the new system evaluated specific damage indicators and degrees of destruction. Greensburg would soon become one of the most significant tests of this recently introduced methodology. Methodically moving from structure to structure, survey teams documented how different buildings had responded to the storm. The process required far more than simply observing whether a building remained standing. Investigators examined how walls failed, how roofs separated from supporting structures, and how foundations performed under extreme stress. Different types of buildings respond differently to tornado winds, making detailed analysis essential. A damaged house, a commercial building, and a school each offered distinct forms of evidence. Surveyors, therefore, approached the town systematically, gathering information from a wide variety of structures. Particular attention focused on locations where entire homes appeared to have been removed from their foundations. Such damage immediately attracts scrutiny, because it can indicate extremely intense winds. Yet investigators could not simply assume that every swept-away structure represented the highest category of tornado intensity. Construction methods vary considerably, and poorly anchored buildings may fail at lower wind speeds than stronger structures. The challenge facing surveyors was determining whether the observed destruction reflected weaknesses in construction, extraordinary winds, or some combination of both. Engineers participating in the assessment recognized that construction quality played an important role in interpreting severe damage. A tornado survey involves more than cataloguing destruction. It requires understanding how buildings were assembled before they were destroyed. Fasteners, anchor bolts, framing methods, and foundation connections all influence how structures respond to extreme winds. Investigators therefore paid close attention to details that might seem insignificant to casual observers. The absence of certain structural connections could alter the interpretation of damage, while evidence of strong construction could strengthen conclusions about tornado intensity. Separating structural weaknesses from the effects of extreme winds required careful analysis and detailed documentation. Throughout Greensburg, investigators encountered examples that demanded close examination. Some structures displayed signs of catastrophic failure, yet the reasons behind that failure were not always immediately obvious. Engineers and meteorologists worked together to evaluate what the damage revealed. Their goal was not to produce dramatic conclusions, but to develop the most accurate possible estimate of the tornado's strength. Every observation contributed another piece to a larger puzzle. Patterns emerging across multiple neighborhoods suggested that investigators were examining damage of unusual severity. Isolated examples of extreme destruction can occur in many tornadoes, particularly when debris impacts or localized wind variations are involved. What drew increasing attention in Greensburg was the consistency of the damage across substantial portions of the tornado's path. Surveyors repeatedly encountered structures that had suffered catastrophic failure. They observed extensive destruction, affecting residential areas, businesses, and public buildings. The evidence was not concentrated in a single location. Instead, it appeared across large sections of the town. Historical comparisons increasingly entered discussions as surveyors considered how Greensburg related to other violent tornado events. Meteorologists and engineers naturally compare new disasters to previous ones because such comparisons provide valuable context. As the survey progressed, Greensburg increasingly invited those comparisons. The scale of the destruction, the breadth of the damage path, and the number of heavily damaged structures all suggested that investigators were dealing with a tornado that belonged among the most powerful events documented in modern American history. Yet the purpose of the investigation was not to fit Greensburg into history prematurely. It was to allow the evidence itself to guide the conclusion. Evidence collected throughout the town gradually narrowed the range of possible conclusions. Each completed assessment reduced uncertainty. Survey teams compiled observations, reviewed photographs, evaluated structural performance, and compared findings across different locations. As more information became available, certain interpretations became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The damage was not merely severe. It displayed characteristics associated with the highest levels of tornado destruction recognized by meteorologists and engineers. Investigators remained cautious, but the evidence was steadily directing them toward a particular outcome. One question remained particularly important as the investigation progressed. How should such destruction be classified under the new scale? The enhanced Fujita scale had been created to improve the process of evaluating tornado damage, but Greensburg presented an extraordinary challenge. The town offered one of the first opportunities to apply the new system to a tornado of exceptional intensity. Surveyors understood that their findings would carry significance beyond Greensburg itself. Whatever conclusion they reached would help define how the enhanced Fujita scale was understood during its earliest months of use. The investigation had begun with a search for answers hidden in the debris, and now those answers were converging toward a decision that would become part of meteorological history. The answer would place Greensburg at the center of a historic decision that would shape how the tornado was remembered, the first EF5. As investigators assembled their findings, the evidence collected throughout Greensburg was beginning to point toward a conclusion of unusual significance. Days earlier, the town had been defined by uncertainty. Residents had wondered whether loved ones survived, responders had searched through debris for answers, and survey teams had attempted to understand the scale of the destruction. Now, a different question was emerging. Meteorologists and engineers had gathered thousands of observations from across the damage path, and those observations were steadily converging toward a judgment that would extend beyond Greensburg itself. The conclusion would influence not only how the tornado was remembered, but also how a newly adopted rating system would be understood. Only months before the tornado struck, the United States had adopted a new method for evaluating tornado intensity. On February 1, 2007, the enhanced Fujita scale officially replaced the original Fujita scale that had been used for decades. The change reflected years of research involving meteorologists and structural engineers who sought to improve the relationship between observed damage and estimated wind speeds. While the original Fujita scale had played a critical role in tornado science, experts recognized opportunities to refine the process. The enhanced Fujita scale was intended to provide more accurate estimates by incorporating engineering analysis and a broader range of damage indicators. Developed with input from meteorologists and engineers, the enhanced Fujita scale was designed to provide more realistic estimates of tornado winds. Rather than relying on broad descriptions alone, the new system evaluated specific types of structures and objects. Homes, schools, businesses, transmission towers, and trees could all serve as damage indicators. Investigators assessed the degree of damage associated with each indicator and used those observations to estimate likely wind speeds. The approach acknowledged an important reality. Not all buildings fail in the same way, and understanding how they were constructed is essential when interpreting tornado damage. At the top of the scale sat a category reserved for the most extreme tornado damage imaginable. EF0 through EF4 classifications covered a wide range of tornado intensities, but EF5 represented something different. It was the highest rating available under the system, reserved for the most violent tornadoes capable of causing catastrophic destruction. Assigning an EF5 rating required compelling evidence, because the classification carried considerable scientific and historical significance. Surveyors could not rely on assumptions. They needed clear documentation supporting the conclusion that the tornado had produced damage consistent with the upper limits of what tornadoes are capable of inflicting. Survey data gathered across Greensburg repeatedly directed attention toward that highest category. As investigators moved through the town, they encountered damage that demanded careful examination. Numerous structures had been completely destroyed. Some homes had been swept from their foundations. Large sections of the community exhibited destruction of exceptional severity, yet investigators remained cautious. Extreme damage alone does not automatically justify an EF5 rating. Survey teams needed to determine whether the destruction reflected extraordinary winds, weaknesses in construction, or a combination of both. Their responsibility was to let the evidence guide the conclusion, rather than allowing the visual impact of the disaster to dictate the outcome. Estimated wind speeds associated with the most severe damage reached approximately 205 miles per hour. These estimates were not derived from direct measurements taken inside the tornado itself. Instead, they resulted from detailed analysis of the destruction left behind. Investigators examined how structures failed, how debris was distributed, and how various damage indicators compared with established engineering expectations. The resulting estimates suggested wind speeds consistent with the most violent category on the enhanced Fujita scale. Although no instrument recorded the tornado's peak winds directly, the evidence preserved throughout Greensburg provided a compelling basis for those calculations. For the experts reviewing the evidence, the decision carried importance beyond a single tornado event. The Greensburg tornado was not merely a destructive weather disaster. It also represented one of the earliest opportunities to apply the enhanced Fujita scale to an event of extraordinary intensity. Meteorologists understood that the conclusions reached in Greensburg would inevitably influence public and professional perceptions of the new system. The rating assigned to the tornado would become one of the first major demonstrations of how the enhanced Fujita scale functioned in practice. Eventually, investigators reached the conclusion that the damage supported an EF5 classification. The determination reflected the cumulative weight of the evidence gathered throughout the survey process. No single building, photograph, or observation produced the final decision on its own. Instead, investigators considered the entirety of the damage path and the patterns that emerged across Greensburg. Those patterns consistently pointed toward a tornado capable of producing the most extreme damage recognized by the scale. The conclusion was significant but not unexpected. By the time the assessment was complete, the evidence had steadily narrowed the range of plausible alternatives. With that determination, the Greensburg tornado entered meteorological history in a unique way. It became the first tornado officially assigned an EF5 rating under the enhanced Fujita scale. The designation permanently linked Greensburg to the early history of the new system. Future EF5 tornadoes would eventually be documented elsewhere, but Greensburg would always occupy a distinct position as the first event to receive the scale's highest classification. The rating transformed the tornado from a devastating local disaster into an important reference point within tornado science. Yet even the highest rating available could describe only part of what had occurred in western Kansas. Tornado ratings are valuable tools for understanding and comparing storms, but they cannot fully capture the human experience of living through them. An EF5 designation communicates the severity of the winds and the extraordinary nature of the damage, but it does not describe the fear felt inside shelters, the uncertainty that followed the tornado's passage, or the challenges faced by a community struggling to recover. Scientific classifications provide context, but they do not tell the entire story. Behind every damage indicator and engineering assessment stood a community facing the consequences of the storm. The rating process transformed destroyed homes into data points and damaged structures into evidence. Yet those structures had once been places where people lived, worked, and gathered. Throughout Greensburg, the scientific investigation unfolded alongside the practical realities of recovery. Residents were confronting decisions about housing, rebuilding, and the future of their town even as survey teams continued documenting what had happened. The tornado's classification answered an important question, but many others remained unresolved. Attention gradually shifted away from classification and toward the future of the town itself. The investigation had established that Greensburg experienced one of the most powerful tornadoes ever documented. The supercell's remarkable history had been studied. The damage had been surveyed. The tornado had received its place in meteorological records. Yet none of those accomplishments repaired homes, restored businesses, or rebuilt neighborhoods. The challenge facing Greensburg was no longer determining what had happened. It was deciding what would happen next. The challenge ahead was no longer understanding what the tornado had done, but deciding how Greensburg would move forward after it. Rebuilding what was lost. With the tornado's intensity now established, attention increasingly shifted toward questions that no damage survey could answer. The investigation had determined how powerful the storm had been and where it belonged within meteorological history. Those findings were important, but they did little to address the realities confronting the people of Greensburg. Scientific conclusions could explain the past, yet the community's greatest challenges existed in the future. The tornado had lasted only minutes. Recovery would require years. As residents looked across a town that had been fundamentally altered, uncertainty took on a new form. The question was no longer what had happened. The question was what came next. Across Greensburg, the physical consequences of the disaster remained visible long after the storm itself had disappeared. Approximately 95% of the town had sustained damage or destruction. Hundreds of homes were gone. Businesses had been destroyed. Public buildings that once served as gathering places, workplaces and community landmarks had either vanished or suffered severe damage. Roads could be cleared and debris could be removed, but restoring the functions those buildings provided would take far longer. Every missing structure represented not only physical loss, but also a challenge that needed to be addressed before daily life could begin returning to something resembling normality. Few communities faced the challenge of deciding how to move forward after losing such a large portion of their built environment. In the weeks and months following the tornado, residents confronted decisions that extended far beyond reconstruction plans. Some families faced questions about whether to remain in Greensburg at all. Others considered relocating permanently. Businesses evaluated whether reopening was financially possible. The disaster had not affected every resident equally, yet everyone found themselves participating in a conversation about the town's future. Recovery was not simply a matter of rebuilding structures. It involved determining whether the community itself would remain intact. Temporary solutions became an essential part of daily life for many residents in the months that followed. Housing presented one of the most immediate challenges. Families whose homes had been destroyed needed places to live while longer-term plans were developed. Temporary housing units, trailers, and other accommodations helped fill the gap, but such arrangements were never intended to serve as permanent answers. Daily routines became more complicated. Activities that once required only a short trip across town often involved navigating an environment still adapting to the consequences of the tornado. The process of rebuilding a community required far more than construction projects alone. Conversations about recovery often centered on what Greensburg should become rather than simply what it had been. Rebuilding offered an opportunity, but it also presented difficult choices. Some residents wanted to restore familiar aspects of the town as closely as possible. Others viewed reconstruction as a chance to rethink how Greensburg could function in the future. These discussions reflected a broader challenge common to many disaster-stricken communities. When rebuilding begins, decisions must be made not only about replacing what was lost, but also about determining whether different approaches might better serve future generations. Gradually, new ideas emerged regarding how reconstruction might address both immediate needs and future risks. Community leaders, planners, and residents explored approaches that could strengthen the town while also improving resilience. Greensburg eventually became known for embracing sustainable design principles during reconstruction, but those developments did not appear overnight. They emerged through planning, discussion, and a willingness to consider alternatives. The tornado had forced the community to rebuild. The manner in which that rebuilding occurred would become one of the defining features of Greensburg's recovery. Progress rarely arrived in dramatic moments, instead appearing through a series of incremental steps. A cleared lot, a repaired service, a reopened business, or a newly completed structure could each represent meaningful progress, even when viewed against the backdrop of widespread destruction. Recovery often unfolds slowly enough that changes can seem almost imperceptible from one day to the next. Yet over months and years, those individual steps accumulate. Greensburg's recovery followed that pattern. The transformation was not immediate. It was the result of sustained effort applied over a long period of time. Not every loss could be measured through buildings, infrastructure, or financial costs. Disasters alter communities in ways that extend beyond physical damage. Some residents chose not to return. Others found themselves adapting to a town that looked very different from the one they remembered. Familiar landmarks were gone. Neighborhoods changed. Even when reconstruction succeeded, certain aspects of the pre-tornado community could not be fully restored. Recovery therefore involved balancing optimism about the future with recognition of what had been permanently lost. Signs of renewal nevertheless began appearing throughout the community as reconstruction efforts continued. New buildings rose where debris once lay, public facilities gradually returned, businesses reopened. The appearance of construction projects signalled more than economic recovery. It reflected confidence that Greensburg still had a future worth investing in. Each completed structure represented evidence that the town was moving beyond survival and into a new phase of development. The physical landscape remained different, but it was no longer defined solely by destruction. Years after the tornado, a rebuilt Greensburg was taking shape in ways few residents could have fully imagined during those first difficult weeks. The community that emerged differed from the one that existed before May 2007. New construction incorporated modern approaches. Infrastructure improvements reflected lessons learned during recovery. The town's appearance gradually evolved into something that blended remembrance of the past with preparation for the future. While the disaster remained an important part of Greensburg's identity, it no longer represented the entirety of the town's story. What emerged was neither a complete return to the past nor a simple replacement for what had been destroyed. Recovery transformed Greensburg into a community shaped by both loss and adaptation. The town preserved connections to its history while also embracing changes that would have seemed unlikely before the tornado. Residents who remained faced years of work, planning and adjustment, yet their efforts produced results that extended beyond restoring basic services and structures. The rebuilding process became a defining chapter in Greensburg's history in its own right. The town's recovery was gradually creating a story that extended far beyond the tornado itself. What began as a disaster recovery effort increasingly attracted attention for the choices made during reconstruction and the vision guiding those choices. The significance of Greensburg was no longer limited to the storm that destroyed it. Increasingly, people looked to the community as an example of how a town could respond after experiencing one of the most devastating tornado impacts in American history. In time, the choices made after the disaster would become nearly as influential as the storm that forced them to be made. The legacy of Greensburg. Long after reconstruction projects began changing the appearance of Greensburg, the consequences of the tornado continued extending far beyond the town itself. Many disasters fade from public attention once debris is removed and damaged buildings are replaced. Greensburg followed a different path. The tornado that struck on May 4, 2007, remained relevant long after recovery efforts began, because its influence reached into fields as varied as urban planning, engineering, meteorology, and emergency management. What happened in western Kansas became more than a local tragedy. Over time, it evolved into a reference point used by researchers, planners, and disaster specialists seeking to understand both the destructive power of tornadoes and the possibilities that can emerge after catastrophe. Rather than rebuilding exactly what had existed before, the community gradually developed a different identity. The tornado had removed much of the physical landscape that defined Greensburg for generations, but reconstruction created opportunities to rethink what the town could become. Community leaders, residents, and planners faced difficult choices during the rebuilding process. Simply recreating the past was one option. Exploring new approaches was another. As reconstruction advanced, Greensburg increasingly became known not only for what had been destroyed, but also for what was being created in its place. National attention increasingly focused on Greensburg as new buildings and planning decisions reflected ambitious goals for sustainability. The community embraced energy-efficient construction and environmentally conscious development to a degree that attracted widespread interest. Greensburg became associated with green building initiatives and sustainable design principles that were uncommon for a town of its size. Public buildings, schools, businesses, and community facilities increasingly reflected these priorities. What began as a recovery effort gradually transformed into a nationally recognized example of how reconstruction could be approached differently after a major disaster. Observers from outside Kansas often arrived expecting to see a town defined solely by the memory of destruction. Instead, many encountered a community attempting to shape a distinct future. This transformation did not erase the tornado's history. Evidence of the disaster remained present in memories, photographs, and the altered appearance of the town itself. Yet Greensburg's identity gradually expanded beyond the tornado. The community became known not only for surviving a disaster, but also for pursuing a particular vision of recovery. In that sense, the rebuilding process became part of the town's legacy rather than merely a response to its losses. Within the field of meteorology, the tornado established a significance that extended well beyond its damage path. The Greensburg tornado occupies an important place in the history of severe weather research because it became the first tornado assigned an EF5 rating under the newly introduced enhanced Fujita scale. As a result, it quickly became a point of reference for discussions about tornado intensity, damage assessment, and engineering analysis. Researchers examining later tornadoes frequently compared their findings with lessons learned from Greensburg. The storm helped shape understanding of how the new rating system functioned when confronted with one of the most destructive tornadoes ever documented. Researchers and engineers continued examining lessons drawn from Greensburg years after the disaster occurred. Damage surveys conducted after major tornadoes often contribute valuable information about building performance and structural vulnerability. Greensburg provided an unusually extensive collection of observations because of both the scale of the destruction and the detailed investigations that followed. Engineers studied how various structures responded to extreme winds. Meteorologists analysed the relationship between damage and estimated wind speeds. Together, those efforts contributed to a broader understanding of tornado impacts and how future communities might better prepare for similar events. Emergency managers also viewed the event as an important example of how warning systems can influence survival outcomes. The tornado inflicted extraordinary damage, yet the number of survivors remained striking when compared with the scale of the destruction. Numerous factors contributed to that outcome, including advance warnings, communication between forecasters and storm observers, and the widespread availability of basements and shelters. Greensburg, therefore, became part of larger discussions regarding public safety, warning dissemination, and severe weather preparedness. The disaster demonstrated both the limits of protection against extreme tornadoes and the value of actions taken before they arrive. Meteorologists studying the outbreak frequently returned to the remarkable behavior of the supercell responsible for the tornado. The Greensburg tornado alone would have guaranteed a place in weather history, yet the parent storm's broader performance added another layer of significance. The supercell persisted for hours, repeatedly cycling and producing tornadoes across Kansas. Estimates commonly attribute approximately 22 tornadoes to the storm over the course of its lifespan. Such longevity and productivity remain unusual even among severe weather events. For researchers interested in cyclic supercells, the outbreak continues to offer valuable opportunities for study. What keeps Greensburg relevant is the way multiple stories intersect within a single event. Some people remember it primarily as one of the most destructive tornadoes in modern American history. Others view it through the lens of meteorology, focusing on the first EF5 classification under the enhanced Fujita scale. Still others point to the town's reconstruction and transformation into a model for sustainable development. Each perspective highlights a different aspect of the same disaster. Together, they explain why Greensburg continues attracting attention long after the storm itself disappeared. Visitors to the town today can still find reminders of both destruction and recovery. Empty spaces, memorials, and altered landscapes provide subtle evidence of what occurred in 2007. At the same time, new buildings and infrastructure reflect the choices made during reconstruction. The town that exists today is not identical to the community that stood before the tornado, yet neither is it defined solely by loss. Greensburg occupies a space between remembrance and renewal, carrying visible traces of both experiences. Even after years of study, reflection, and rebuilding, Greensburg continues to occupy a distinctive place in American disaster history. The tornado's classification, the storm's unusual behavior, the community's recovery, and the scientific lessons drawn from the event have ensured its lasting relevance. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the story is that it cannot be reduced to a single theme. It is simultaneously a story about meteorology, engineering, emergency management, resilience, and memory. Every attempt to understand Greensburg inevitably encounters all of those dimensions at once. Nearly 2 decades later, the events of May 4, 2007, remain frozen in weather records and historical archives, but their influence continues moving forward. New tornadoes are still compared against Greensburg. New discussions about disaster recovery still reference its reconstruction. New generations of meteorologists still encounter storms while studying the enhanced Fujita scale. The town's experience became part of a larger conversation about how communities respond when confronted with forces far beyond their control. In that sense, the story never truly ended when the tornado dissipated north of town. Somewhere between the science that explains the tornado and the human stories that survived it, Greensburg still leaves questions worth asking.